On the Banks Peninsula of New Zealand's South Island, agriculture once fell into crisis as thousands of hectares of steep hillsides were eroded and completely overrun by this thorny weed, an extremely dangerous spiny shrub. To protect sheep farms, local authorities decided to launch an aggressive eradication campaign using thousands of liters of toxic chemicals and controlled burning. But botanist Hugh Wilson firmly refused to destroy it. His declaration that he would step back and allow the weeds to grow freely immediately ignited a fierce controversy. Angry neighboring farmers called him a madman spreading disaster, accusing him of turning the valley into a wildfire time bomb and threatening to push surrounding farms toward collapse. Local authorities also repeatedly issued penalties and threatened prosecution under the Biosecurity Act for deliberately harboring what they considered a national biosecurity criminal. Despite intense pressure and the risk of being taken to court, Hugh Wilson quietly remained committed to his decision. A few decades later, what people saw across this land astonished both biologists and those who had once opposed him. To uncover the answer, researchers returned to the site and began examining the unusual biochemical clues that had been overlooked beneath the soil. The first clue was found directly beneath the base of this thorny weed, one of the most hated plants in New Zealand. Biochemical analysis of the soil revealed a major contradiction. The dry biomass in its upper stems contains extremely high levels of biological oils, making it an ideal fuel source for catastrophic wildfires. But below ground, this invasive member of the legume family continuously pumps between 100 and 150 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare into exhausted soil every year. This rate of nitrogen fixation is comparable to applying tons of high-quality chemical fertilizer across eroded hillsides. The second clue appeared in the soil beneath the thorny canopy. When botanists pushed aside the dense network of sharp spines that formed a barrier almost like a steel wall, they did not find a barren wasteland. Instead, they discovered an ideal microclimate, where humidity near the ground remained consistently high, and fluctuations in soil temperature were greatly reduced. These conditions allowed seeds from native woody species such as maho to germinate at rates 3 to 5 times higher than on vast windswept grazing fields exposed to direct sunlight. The third clue came from the physical fire characteristics of the contrasting vegetation types. Experimental reports from the Scion Forestry Research Institute confirmed that dry gorse represents an extremely high wildfire risk. In contrast, thick-leaved native broadleaf species such as maho and fuchsia contain exceptionally high levels of water within their tissues. Their canopies can resist and suppress fire 4 to 6 times more effectively than gorse vegetation. The chemical evidence revealed that the most hated plant in the country was quietly preparing a rich source of nutrients for the very native species that would eventually replace it. Before discovering the true nature of this soil-restoring plant, humans had spent more than half a century pursuing an expensive technological strategy that created numerous unintended consequences. For many decades of the 20th century, both local authorities and farming communities across New Zealand agreed that gorse should be treated as a biosecurity criminal and a dangerous weed that had to be eradicated at any cost. New Zealand's Biosecurity Act, together with regulations imposed by the Canterbury Regional Council, placed severe legal obligations on any landowner who allowed gorse to spread. Millions of dollars were spent on this war against the weed. Helicopters and high-pressure spraying systems distributed thousands of liters of powerful herbicides, such as glyphosate and tordon, across the hillsides. Alongside chemical treatments, controlled burns and bulldozers were deployed on a massive scale to clear the thorny vegetation. The strategy appeared perfectly logical because removing the biomass seemed capable of destroying the plants and returning the land to open pasture for sheep. But field results created an unexpected cycle of ecological disaster. Every time herbicides were sprayed or controlled fires swept across the land, the protective layer of organic litter was stripped away, exposing bare soil to intense sunlight. This action unintentionally activated an enormous seed bank hidden deep beneath the ground. Gorse seeds can remain dormant in soil for as long as 50 years without losing their ability to germinate. Once exposed to direct sunlight on cleared ground, millions of gorse seeds began germinating simultaneously at densities twice as high as before the eradication effort. Every application of herbicide and every controlled burn appeared to deliver a victory, but in reality, humans had just pressed the activation button for millions of thorny seedlings waiting beneath the soil. To understand why this chemical trap tightened its grip on the entire landscape, we have to return to a historical turning point from 200 years ago. Before humans arrived, Banks Peninsula was covered by a multi-layered, temperate rainforest ecosystem across more than 99% of its land area, stretching continuously from mist-covered mountain peaks all the way down to the edge of the Pacific Ocean. Successive waves of Polynesian settlement, followed by European colonization in the 19th century, permanently disrupted this natural order. Ancient forests filled with thousand-year-old trees were cut down for shipbuilding and construction. What remained was burned to clear land for sheep pastures, supplying the export industry. By 1900, less than 1% of the original ancient forest remained, surviving only as scattered fragments inside remote and inaccessible ravines. To divide their sheep farms, European settlers introduced gorse from their homeland as a natural hedge. They failed to anticipate how rapidly the plant would adapt. As steep hillsides were overgrazed, the organic-rich topsoil washed into the sea, leaving the land nutrient-depleted and severely eroded. Sheep could no longer survive on the barren slopes, forcing farmers to abandon the land. It was inside these degraded openings that gorse began escaping from the hedgerows and taking over entire valleys. By 1900, the great forests of Banks Peninsula had entered a state of near total collapse. On the exhausted soil, nature was left with only one thorny shrub capable of holding its ground. What humans saw as an invasive species disaster was actually hiding a forgotten ecological link, one that also represented gorse's own fatal weakness. That fatal weakness lies in the way gorse performs photosynthesis. This plant requires direct sunlight in order to grow. Gorse thrives aggressively on exposed, sunlit ground, but it gradually dies when placed under deep shade. Botanist Hugh Wilson and the Morris White Native Forest Trust recognized this ecological link when they began managing Hinawai Reserve in 1987. At the time, they introduced a radically different strategy based on a philosophy of minimal intervention. This approach required people to immediately stop all chemical eradication of gorse, stop controlled burning, and avoid large-scale manual planting of native trees. They viewed the thorny gorse cover as a form of biological scaffolding. Gorse grows between 2 and 3 meters tall, shielding the land from salty ocean winds, retaining soil moisture, and adding nitrogen to the ground below. Beneath that strong protective framework, beyond the reach of grazing animals, seedlings of shade-tolerant native trees, such as maho and kanuka, begin quietly growing upward. During the first 10 to 15 years, native trees grow slowly beneath the gorse. By around year 20, their crowns begin rising above the tops of the gorse shrubs. Once the maho canopy closes overhead, it cuts off the sunlight, reaching the weed below. Without enough sunlight for photosynthesis, the entire layer of gorse gradually weakens, dries, decomposes, and disappears naturally, surrendering the ground to a complete multi-layered native forest. Gorse behaves like a strict but blind guardian. It protects the native seedlings growing beneath it, only for those same seedlings to eventually rise above and permanently cut off its source of light. Once this biological weakness was recognized, a turning point in the history of New Zealand conservation occurred when humans stopped attacking the weed and allowed it to grow. In 1987, the Maurice White Native Forest Trust officially purchased 109 hectares of barren, gorse-covered hillside at Hinawai to begin testing this new management philosophy. 4 years later, in 1991, the trust purchased the neighboring Otanerito livestock farm, expanding the conservation area almost tenfold to more than 1,200 hectares and later to more than 1,500 hectares. The decision immediately triggered intense anger from the local farming community and federated farmers of New Zealand. Farmers viewed the Hinawai approach as an insult to traditional agricultural work ethics. They described the Hinawai researchers as naive urban dreamers and threatened to file complaints with local authorities. Under pressure from the Biosecurity Act, the Canterbury Regional Council required Hinawai either to control the gorse or at least maintain a manually cleared boundary strip dozens of meters wide to prevent gorse seeds from spreading onto neighboring land. On field maps, the disputed boundary appeared extremely sharp. On one side were sheep farms, repeatedly sprayed with herbicide to maintain bare ground, while on the other stood Hinawai's dense gorse cover, already beginning to reveal the first shoots of native trees rising through it. To neighboring farmers, allowing gorse to grow was not conservation, but an irresponsible surrender that could turn the valley into a ticking time bomb. Beneath that rejected thorny surface, however, a quiet but powerful ecological counterattack had officially begun. The transformation of vegetation at Hinawai did not occur randomly, but followed a deeply structured chain reaction. The first link was a chemical transformation of the soil. Through the continuous nitrogen fixation provided by gorse, soil fertility recovered rapidly. The second link was the closing canopy formed by pioneering native broadleaf trees such as maho, pittosporum, and native fuchsia. The third link, and the most important engine of seed dispersal, was the return of native birds. The kereroo, New Zealand's native wood pigeon and the only remaining bird with a throat large enough to swallow the seeds of large ancient trees, such as miro and karaka, returned to the gorse-covered landscape for shelter. There, they ate fruit from the few surviving fragments of old forest and deposited seeds evenly beneath the gorse canopy. The thorny gorse acted as a natural fortress, protecting young native seedlings from grazing animals. Once native trees rose above the gorse canopy, after 15 to 20 years, they attracted nectar-feeding birds, such as bellbirds and tui, back into the area. The network of pollination and seed dispersal became reconnected from the mountain peaks all the way to the coast. When the multi-layered native forest canopy finally closed completely, the thick, organic litter beneath it began functioning like a giant sponge, holding rainfall within the landscape. Local hydrology improved dramatically, as 47 streams and waterfalls that had once dried up every summer during the sheep farming era began flowing consistently throughout the year, even during severe droughts. If you are following this ecological investigation, press subscribe to join us as we uncover the next environmental mysteries. The wings of the kereroo became seed dispersal engineers, taking nourishment from the old forest and delivering the future of the new forest directly into the heart of the thorny fortress. This counterattack appeared to prove that the Hinawai philosophy worked extremely well, until contradictory evidence from other parts of the world came to light. When researchers examined the Hinawai model through the lens of objective science, they were forced to confront rigorous contradictory evidence. The first concern was the very real risk of wildfire. Federated Farmers of New Zealand and weed researchers at Ag Research issued a warning that was physically correct. During the first 15-year window, when gorse grows at maximum density but native trees have not yet risen high enough to close the canopy, the entire restoration area is effectively an extremely high-risk wildfire zone. If fire breaks out during this period, the intense heat released from the oils inside gorse can destroy all of the young native seedlings. The fire can then activate the underground gorse seed bank, causing another massive germination event and forcing ecological succession back to the beginning. Hinawai was fortunate because the wildfire in 2011 occurred during the 24th year of the project, by which time the native forest had already developed a moisture-rich barrier capable of slowing the flames. The second and more decisive piece of contradictory evidence comes from Houghton Plains National Park in Sri Lanka. In this tropical highland region, gorse was also introduced by the British as a hedge and rapidly spread across the native montane grasslands. However, when land managers adopted a non-intervention approach, the result was completely different from what happened in New Zealand. After more than 50 years, the gorse at Houghton Plains had neither declined nor been replaced, but instead transformed the entire plateau into a permanently dominant thorny shrubland. Bioclimatic analysis identified the absence of three critical ecological conditions in Sri Lanka. First, Houghton Plains experiences a prolonged dry season and lacks the abundant annual rainfall of more than 1,000 millimeters found on Banks Peninsula. Second, Sri Lanka's local vegetation lacks native woody species capable of rapidly growing taller than gorse because much of the native flora in this landscape consists of low montane grasses. Third, populations of large seed-dispersing birds have declined severely, leaving too few animals capable of transporting tree seeds into the middle of the thorny shrubland. If the Hinawai model were applied in a dry region without seed-dispersing birds, the result would not be native forest, but an invasive shrubland that could become nearly impossible to reverse. After placing all the evidence of success and failure side by side, what is the final verdict in this ecological case? The entire ecological investigation at Hinawai Reserve leads us to a very clear conditional verdict. During the 2011 wildfire, the flames were suppressed by a purely physical process, as the vegetation had shifted from highly flammable, oil-rich gorse to moisture-rich broadleaf vegetation dominated by trees such as maho. The direct cause of this transformation was the deliberate exploitation of gorse's intolerance of shade by using the height of native trees to cut off its access to sunlight. The deeper cause was the ability of the soil to recover its fertility through nitrogen fixation performed by the invasive plant itself, creating the foundation for the ecosystem to rebuild its groundwater reserves. The decisive factors determining success or failure are the required presence of three ecological conditions: abundant rainfall throughout the year, native bird populations capable of dispersing seeds, and native woody species that can grow taller than the invasive shrub. One problem remains permanently unresolved. The 50-year-old gorse seed bank continues to lie dormant beneath the forest soil at Hinawai. If a major geological disaster, such as a powerful earthquake, causes landslides, destroys the native canopy, and exposes the ground to sunlight again, gorse could immediately return. The Hinawai model does not prove that invasive weeds are always beneficial, nor does it prove that humans should adopt a hands-off approach everywhere in the world. Field data confirms that nature possesses extraordinarily powerful mechanisms of self-repair, But those mechanisms function only within extremely strict ecological boundaries. Nature does not always need humans to repair it. It needs humans to be intelligent enough to know when to step back, and knowledgeable enough to understand the conditions that allow an ecosystem to heal itself.